Hi, thank you so much for joining us. Our guest today, Dr. Fiona Aubrey-Smith, a leader, teacher and academic with a passion for supporting those who work with young people and students. She is the founder of One Life Learning, a widely published author, and also the founder of the National PedTech Partnership here in the UK. Fiona, I would love to begin with your book, From EdTech to PedTech. What is the focus of the book?
So from EdTech to PedTech, their full title adds to the end of that, changing the way that we think about digital technology. And the books come from originally some PhD research that really dug into this in a lot of detail, looking at the relationship between the teacher's views and beliefs about education and how they then consequently use digital technology in practice. So the book takes us on a journey about what our pedagogy is, what influences it, where it comes from, how that manifests through what we say, what we intend and what we actually do in practice, and then guides us through on a journey of thinking, once we're clear on that pedagogy, how can the digital tools we have in our contemporary toolkit support, extend and enhance that, and where we want to leave digital outside the space.
Thank you so much. So from your perspective, what are the huge opportunities and challenges that are facing education today?
I think the greatest thing is thinking about the young people that are actually in our classrooms today. So much of what we have as a system is based on previous cohorts of young people, previous experiences, previous ways of working. But of course, the young people in our classrooms today, our Generation Alpha, our Gen Z students, they have a different kind of mindset about their lives. It's much more of an personalised, on-demand, at the point of need approach to thinking about the world. And our classrooms don't always operate like that at the moment. But there's huge potential for us to utilise a contemporary digital toolset to bring them exactly that. That's not just a challenge, that's an opportunity, I think, for us all to grapple, grasp and really celebrate.
Fiona, you work a lot with schools. What else are you noticing at the moment?
A lot of my research work is classroom-based. So in the last year or so, I've probably been in about 320 classrooms, ranging from nursery-age learners right the way through to sixth form, state schools, independent, mainstream schools and special provision. And one of the things that's really striking is how often we lean into intentions, great intentions, but what teachers might timetable to do, plan to do, lesson plans and materials, all about great intentions for learning. And I think actually if we want to look at a baseline for improving what we offer young people, we just need to think about that slightly different and change the pivot point from focusing on the teacher and what the teacher does to focusing on our learners, our young people. What are they actually experiencing and how are they actually internalising those learning experiences? And that gives us the reality, not just the intentions. And if we have that reality, clarity about what young people are really living and experiencing in our classrooms, that's the baseline that we want to base our thinking around.
So Fiona, how should we be thinking about the ways we use technology when it comes to learning?
It's a great question. I think too often we forget to start with the question, what do we actually mean by learning? And what's the structural support for learning that we put in place around our young people? So when we're thinking about digital technology in that landscape, what we want to be thinking of, how do we want to support learning in its broadest sense? Curriculum and extracurricular, academic learning, vocational, pastoral learning, learning at school, learning at home, all of those sorts of things. And then not just how do we support learning, but how do we want to enhance and augment learning? Where can we take that learning? Where can we move it beyond what was traditionally possible? And then where do we want to extend and stretch learning? How do we nudge learners in their thinking beyond that which happens in a traditional classroom through traditional activities, traditional teacher-learner exchange? So those really important components of structural support for learning all get transcended into a much more exciting, impactful space if we start with what do we really mean by learning and how do we want to support, extend or enhance that. But there's also another component to that, which is where do we not want digital to sit? Where do we want to protect the skills that are about human relationships and interaction? And digital can play a role surrounding those, but sometimes we just want to be thinking about protecting relationship development, protecting oracy skills, all of those sorts of things. But it all comes back to what do we see as learning and how do we want to move that forwards?
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. And Fiona, I know you've done a lot of work with Leo Academy Trust. We had Emma and Lexi here today as well filming. Can you tell me a little bit about how you started working with them?
Well, Phil Hedger, the absolutely inspirational CEO of Leo Academy Trust, he and I had a conversation that was very much about they have this one-to-one Chromebook provision and this holistic Google ecosystem across the Academy Trust, and what difference is it actually making? And it's very easy to look at that at surface level with attainment, attendance, all of those kind of traditional accountability metrics. And Leo Academy Trust are not only outperforming national averages, but the gap between those national averages and what they're achieving has been growing and growing year on year over a sustained period of time. But actually the impact that they're seeing is much deeper than that. It's about more inclusive practice for the young people across the schools. You see this in every classroom, across every school. And that's where Phil, the CEO's vision, has been absolutely core, because he sees the whole trust as an organisation for supporting learning and learners, first, second, third and last. And that's deeply empowering for then how digital fits into that place and supports learners in the classroom, professionals as learners, the community as learners, and creates this very community-oriented space, which I think lies at the heart of their impact.
Fiona, can you tell me what was most interesting about the many different forms of impact that you saw when working with Leo Academy?
Well, when we first started looking at their impact journey, it was really interesting to think about not just the traditional accountability metrics, which of course everybody's most interested in to start with, but what's really happening in those young people's lives? What are they really experiencing? How are they really internalising that? So we spent a lot of time really closely tracking specific children in their classrooms to really understand their journey and their experience. And some really fascinating things came out of that in ways that we weren't necessarily originally expecting. So the role of the one-to-one Chromebook provision is key across Leo Academy Trust, but it's not actually the one-to-one provision per se that's been the key to, or the lever to the impact. It's been this vision that Phil's driven of those Chromebooks are available on demand at the point of need.
Yeah.
And young people have the agency to grab that tool and help them at the point they need it at. And they've got a culture and behavioural expectations that mean they take the tool, they use it for the task, they put it away again. So there's no disruption to learning. It's a tool used for a purpose at the right time in the right way.
Amazing.
That's been massively impactful in terms of inclusive practice, and every young person in those classrooms being able to access the same high quality learning experiences. And we've just seen the ripple effect then of what that looks like over time with things like quality of writing. And people are always asking, aren't they, with all this digital, what's going to happen to writing? But actually across Leo Academy Trust, we found that the age-related expectations in terms of writing outcomes have gone up. But what's been even more fascinating is those higher levels of attainment in writing have gone up at an even quicker trajectory.
Wow.
And that's because the whole process of the writing experience, the stimulus, the planning, the drafting, the feedback, the editing, the publishing, all of those things, the toolkit around writing has really empowered young people. So turns out the use of digital can turbocharge writing after all.
Fiona, thank you so much. So can you help me understand, if I was a student doing some creative writing, what would I be using that Chromebook for during my writing practice?
There's so many different ways that we've seen this at Leo Academy Trust and at other schools and other groups of schools as well. And there'll be simple things like we talk about the importance of young people having real world experiences to stimulate their imaginations or as the prompt for the activities they're going to write about. Well, of course, those real world experiences are multisensory, are amazing, are powerful. We absolutely want to keep that. But once a student then moves into a stage where they're planning their writing, they often will forget what they've been doing. They'll forget that real world experience. Well, of course, video capture, they can rewind that real world experience and re-access it. The so-called rewinding a teacher kind of mindset. It might be teachers' direct instruction. It might be something they did outdoors. So that rewinding the real life experience is one component. Another component is starting to brainstorm and get ideas down about what we want to write about, forming structures, planning. There's all sorts of different ways that students have been doing that, through docs, through slides, through collating their ideas in a shared space. And then when students start to form those ideas and really develop their writing, whether they're typing that, whether they're using an audio, a dictate function to capture their ideas, whether they're writing a text and then using Gemini to convert that to some text, there's all sorts of different ways that young people can then represent their work. So that empowers them to then spend their energy, their capacity for learning time on editing, on improving what they've got rather than the production
Yeah.
process. And of course, what that does is it encourages students to really lean into their metacognitive skills of what have I done well? What do I want to improve on? What do I want to enhance? What do I want to change? And we're then in that really precious active cognition space that we know makes a big difference on quality of output. The interesting thing is when we compare that with traditional methods. So in an exercise book, a student might write down their piece of work and there'll be a hard ceiling on the number of edits they'll do, because as soon as they cross out a word or a phrase and improve it, the work looks messy, and we have too much emphasis on neat work in classes. A digital version of that same activity, it looks polished the whole time, but of course with version history you can see exactly how that piece of work's developed over time, so you get that kind of best of both worlds. And that whole process of writing has been supported by digital, but digital's not replacing the writing skills.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful harmony that comes together.
Yeah.
Makes a massive impact on attainment standards and progress.
Amazing. Fiona, following on from that, what is the impact of handwriting when it comes to creative writing?
Yeah, a really interesting question to kind of dig into. There's been a number of lines of inquiry pursued through different impact studies and working with different groups of schools, and there's some really interesting trends come out that span across primary and secondary schools, mainstream and special provision. In particular, work that the brilliant Peter Reeves at Abingdon House School has done some really pathfinding work in this space. When we look at the amount of words that a student writes in a particular amount of time, and we compare how much they can handwrite, how much they can type, and how much they can dictate or voice type, we see some really, really striking figures. And it will be no surprise to most people that think about this that we tend to see more words when students type than when they handwrite, and more words when students voice type or dictate than either typing or handwriting.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
But the really interesting thing is not just that increase in output, in productivity, it's what happens to the quality. Because the focus of the time, because of that levering of productivity, the focus becomes on improving the content and the quality. So you see an improvement in grammar, you see an improvement in depth of thought, creativity in ideas. But that relationship between writing and digital is not about the physical act of handwriting. There's a bit of an urban myth around that at the moment, that we learn things better if we handwrite them. We've dug into that very, very deeply, and it's not the physical act of handwriting, we think. It's the speed at which we create something at. And if we handwrite slower, our thought processes are slowed down and we have more depth and more thinking about what we do. If we want to work on something very creatively and very deeply, we want to work at a slower pace, whether that's using handwriting as a vehicle to be slower, or whether we force ourselves to work slower but using digital methods. Is the pace that's important. Conversely, if we want to just capture something, record something, get it down, be productive, then we want to use the most efficient tool to help us to do that, so we can focus our capacity on improving editing and developing that piece of work. So the question isn't, for me, about do we handwrite something or do we digitally capture that, whether through typing or dictation. The question is, what speed do we want the brain to be thinking at, and which mechanism is best suited to that learner to enable them to think at that speed, because that's where we see the impact on learning.
When is slow good for learning?
There's probably a window, because we could go too slow and too quick, but by working slower, we give our neurological function the capacity to think deeper about what we're doing, because we're thinking through our thoughts in incremental stages. The faster we work, the more our brain's going to move through those stages at a swifter pace. And by doing that, it won't have the depth. It'll be more focused on productivity.
Fiona, those results you saw with Leo Academy Trust are fascinating. Are you seeing that anywhere else?
Yeah, so interestingly, the Leo Academy Trust maybe had the pathfinding PedTech impact report. And there's been a number of other projects that we've been working on since that first report, with a number of other trusts and a number of other groups of schools spanning across all kinds of different contexts. So thinking primary and secondary, mainstream and special, state-funded, independent-funded, and so on. And the findings are absolutely consistent across the space in terms of once one-to-one on-demand ways of working are embedded, and that's really key, that it's on-demand, not just one-to-one, and that it's embedded way of working. Once that's in place, we see the impact on attainment and progression, on satisfaction for learners and teachers, on inclusive practice, on a sense of belonging, we see that increase not just go up at a quicker pace than we might compare to national benchmarks. All of those measures of improvement, those descriptions of improvement, are consistently and increasingly going up. But even more than that, the cumulative impact is making the gap between schools that are working in these ways and national benchmarks greater. And there's a really interesting ethical implication for us there, which is when we know that these sorts of pedagogical techniques work at scale, and we know that there's a cumulative rate at which they start affecting attainment, as well as inclusion, as well as well-being, and all these other sorts of things that you can see in the research reports, then there's a sense of inequity between learners who are benefiting from these things and learners who are not benefiting from these things. And I think that challenges us to think about, what does that mean? What are the implications? Because those young people are going to be living and working with each other in the same communities, in the same global landscape. What do we do about that as a sector? What do we do about that as professionals? And that's, I guess, my question at this stage. How do we start thinking about closing that inequity gap?
And Fiona, what does this all mean more broadly for education at the moment?
There's a really interesting study that we've undertaken with Haileybury, with the brilliant Tom Wade, who's leading the innovation work there, that's looking at what are the ripple effects of having a pedagogy-first vision to the use of digital across a school. This is a high-performing secondary school. What are the ripple effects of having that provision on students and on teachers? Some of the really fascinating findings that have come out of that is how it really challenges the use of the physical environment, the classroom environment. Because, of course, when you've got a digital provision, learning is no longer tied to a desk, to sitting in a chair. Yeah. Learning is no longer tied to one classroom environment. Learning is no longer tied to 30 students and one teacher. You've got all these flexibilities. Once those digital ways of working are in place, teachers are aware, they have that cognizance about what's possible. They have their competence in terms of skills, staff and students. And they have the confidence to be creative, to be innovative, because they've got these familiar, effective ways of working in place. What we then start to see is teachers pushing the boundaries of what learning can look like. And we see spaces where learners are then moving between classrooms and spaces. They're spending some of their time stood up, sat down, indoors, outdoors, with different people, different combinations. If they're doing, I don't know, some field work about geographical pond elements or something like that, then they go out and that's where they're taking their learning. And they've got their devices with them to go and do that. And that really brings learning to life, and it really augments the sensory experience of learning. But more so than that, it also means we've got that broader thought about addressing young people's well-being. Generation Alpha and Gen Z aren't meant to be sat in chairs all day.
No.
So let's offer them provision where they don't have to be. Let's get them moving. Let's get them in different body positions, in different spaces and different environments. A changing concept of what a classroom actually can mean. Changing concept of when and where and how learning takes place and who it's with and what they're doing. That's really, really exciting, because people have long talked about all of these things, but actually doing that at scale across age groups in a whole setting over a sustained period of time, not just the innovators themselves doing it, that's game-changing stuff. And when it's within the existing system, not running in parallel to it, that shows it's possible for all of our young people to benefit from this if we take a pedagogy-first approach to how we think about digital.
Wow. And is it fair to assume that a multi-sensory learning experience is more memorable, more engaging?
The more we're immersed in our learning, emotionally, physically, sensory, the more we're going to want to be involved in that learning. It affects deep motivation, doesn't it? And if we're deeply intrinsically motivated to be part of something, we're going to be self-regulated to take part in that activity. We're going to be creative because we're going to think, how does this relate to us? What do we want to do? How do we want to move us forward? And we're going to be more social and connect to other people as part of our learning.
Fiona, with the advent of generative AI, what do you think we can expect to see in education?
There's so many people talking about this space at the moment, aren't they? And it's really fascinating to hear the nature of conversations. I hear a lot of, we can be more productive with the use of generative AI. We can do this creative thing. We can make things more efficient, time savings, all of this sort of stuff. And I think that conversation is helpful, is useful. And I think other people are speaking to that point way better than I ever could. What I don't hear as much of is what's the human value add in a landscape of generative AI. That's the bit I'm not hearing as much of yet. We hear lots of enthusiasts talk about in AI, let's think more about becoming more human or human intelligence. We hear that. And then that conversation stops.
Yeah.
We don't talk about, okay, what does that look like in
Yeah.
a classroom environment? How do we help learners celebrate their humanness? How
Yeah.
do we help young people lean into developing the skills that they need to be stronger, better, more social, more creative human beings, and do the things that generative AI can't, maybe yet, but can't do. Celebrate the things that make us human, and to really lean into that as part of today's curriculum. Now, there's a number of brilliant schools and organisations, trusts that I'm working with that are pushing that at the moment. And they're doing things like bringing the use of these tools into class. But rather than teaching students how to use AI, how to ask questions, how to use prompts, how to analyse materials, how to create, generative AI-based materials, rather than just doing that, they're doing all that stuff, but rather than just doing that, they're helping young people to understand how to use the AI to help them back. So they're developing prompts so that the students can challenge the AI to ask them questions, to deepen their knowledge and understanding, and to keep asking them prompting and probing questions to make the student think about not just what they know, but why they know it and how they know it, and give examples of it.
Oh, wow.
And that personalised learning coach, if you like, that makes the student think deeper, think harder. And actually, when we ask young people what they want to use generative AI for, most of the time, it's not to cheat, to write, to fast-track learning activities. Most of the time, it's to help them understand things they didn't understand before, or it's to help them revise or challenge their own thinking or extend their ideas, or it's a sense of equity. They know that other young people in other countries around the world are learning how to use these tools at scale, and they know that they'll be sitting the same qualifications, competing for the same jobs as those young people, and they want to be ready for that. They want those skills now. And we deserve to give that to them, or they deserve for us to give that to them.
Fiona, there's a lot of debate as to whether screens in a classroom are a good or a bad thing. Can you tell me a bit more about your view on this?
I find this whole notion of a screen time debate in a classroom absolutely baffling and really frustrating, because how often do we talk about whether we should have chairs in the classroom or desks in the classroom or pencils in the classroom? Why are we thinking differently about screens? When we talk about screens, are we talking about students using screens, or are we talking about the screen at the front of the classroom, the teacher's digital board, front of class board? But if we're also talking about the front of class board and that kind of screen time, how's that different to whiteboards, blackboards, chalkboards? What do we actually mean by screen time in the classroom? And then when we're thinking about that more broadly, what do we think about screen time for young people over the course of a whole day? What about the displays that they go past, the bus stops, the tills, the displays, the screens they see just as part of their everyday life? We're talking about a huge number of different things in a really mashed up, messy way. Actually, I think it's a lot simpler than that. The things that are causing concern are the low demand, low effort types of uses of screens. And actually low demand, low effort, anything is going to be something we don't want to see in the classroom.
And can you give me an example of what a low demand, low effort use is of a screen?
So simple kind of scrolling through something without particularly engaging with it, or a video that's long or that's not purposeful or it's not tied specifically to a task, or messaging on low level photos and video without a clear purpose. It's those kinds of incidental, low thought, low effort types of uses. They're often great for leisure. Young people would talk about using that to chill out, to calm out, to relax. Great, but we don't want to see that in school. We don't want that kind of activity, whether it's digital or otherwise, in a school environment. What we do want are the types of digital tool use that are cognitively active. Work production, creation, formative assessment, self-assessment, creativity, collaboration, those sorts of things that are really leaning into the learning skills and behaviours that we value. That's the sorts of things we want to see. So when we think about what we're using different digital tools for, I think it's a nonsense to refer to them as screens. I think what we want to think about is what's the purpose, what's the use, what's the tool, what's the pedagogy, what's the learning going on here? And if that drives the conversation forward, then we're focused on quality, not just the vehicle that something's happening through. A number of educators have asked me, what's the right amount of digital tool use to have in a classroom? What's the right number of minutes or balance? And we've looked into that in a whole range of different impact studies over the last year or so. But it's a really difficult question because it varies immensely from young children to much older students. It would be different for a child in a nursery through to a sixth form student. It varies based on subject, a creative subject, a physical subject compared to a text-based subject or a laboratory-based subject, for example. And it differs depending on the type of pedagogical experience that a teacher wants their students to have. The most important thing that we need to factor into that is these are young people living in a contemporary environment. What will be most effective to support their learning? And that might not be the type of pedagogy that we as educators are always comfortable with. We've got to lean more into what's right for our contemporary learners, not what's comfortable for us as established educators.
Yeah. There's no one-size-fits-all answer, it would seem.
Absolutely. And we don't ask that question with other types of tools and resources. How often do you hear someone talk about pencil time or sitting time? We just don't have that conversation. We don't even talk about exercise book time, and that's a direct comparable, isn't it, to things being on a device. When we think about the use of exercise books, how much time do children spend writing things in exercise books, sticking sheets in exercise books, and how much time do we challenge that everyday experience to say, is that the most effective way for that young person to learn about that particular learning intention or objective? Is that the right vehicle that will help them accelerate their learning the most? And if it is, great, let's do it. If it's not, we need to shift our behaviours and focus on contemporary learning for contemporary learners.
Fiona, what else have you noticed about schools that are doing this well?
One of the other key trends across schools is when they're using digital technology from a pedagogy-first approach, they're not just focused on the digital skills to use these devices and use these contemporary learning tools, but they're also focused on the broader culture that sits around that. There's two key things there. One of them is a classroom culture where young people have agency to choose the tools that they need at the point of learning, at the point of need. And that's critical because that teaches young people really powerful metacognitive skills about what do I need, what will help me, why will that help me, how will that help me. They use that and then they park that and move on to the next part of their learning activity. Really important life skills, metacognitive skills. The other vital part of the jigsaw there is learning, let's call it digital etiquette. So things like closing a Chromebook when it's not being used, turning a front of class board off when it's not being used. When someone's talking, making eye contact with them, not looking at a device whilst listening to them. Those basic etiquette behaviours. Great schools are explicitly teaching and, importantly, explicitly modelling those through teachers' behaviour so that young people are not just learning to use these digital tools, they're learning great digital etiquette, human behaviours, human manners.
So important.
Those two things, when they come into harmony, create habits. And those habits are then things that those young people can take out of school, into the home environment, into their social lives. And actually, we're teaching people to be responsible social citizens, caring about each other, building communities. The use of digital is still there with them when they need it, but it's not a default, it's not a bad habit, it's not an addiction. It's positive, it's purposeful, it's well-mannered. And that's what great schools are doing.
Fiona, one of the takeaways I have taken from your work is your lovely phrase around preserving the dignity of learning. Can you tell us what that means and how tech helps to enable it?
One of the really interesting observations in schools that are relatively early in their digital journey has been an understanding that accessibility tools, for example, can be really powerful for young people with special educational needs and disabilities, as an example. And that's true. That's really, really profound. And we see the impact it makes on inclusion for those young people and on their consequent progress and attainment and behaviour and all sorts. There's clear evidence there. However, what can happen is some schools kind of assign digital provision to the children with SEND. And what then happens is you get students that are a little bit nervous to use it because it's making them feel even more different. So the very students who'd benefit most are those who don't want to use it because they don't want to stick out the most. And that's where this equitable, this ubiquitous provision is really important. Because if tools are in place for all young people, and all young people are in a culture where using all of these accessibility features is normalised as a normal way of working for everybody, no one's sticking out. Now that has a number of effects. First of all, it makes young people with SEND feel more included and more a sense of belonging in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, it enables those tools to support the learning for those who need it most. They can have text, they can hear text while they read it, they can have screen masks, so they reduce cognitive overload, all of these sorts of things. But also the effect on other students' trajectories is significant. So, for example, we'll have students who are maybe compliant students, average or just above average attainment, who, if they could use some of these features, could do so much more. And what we've noticed is all students' progress trajectory goes up if you have these widespread tools available.
So even students that hadn't necessarily been identified as having additional needs formally were using some tools.
Exactly that. And we've seen scenarios where 75% of a class might be using a screen reader, or 75% of a class might be using audio or picture dictionaries to help them develop new vocabulary, things like that. Or simple act of secondary students being able to type their work rather than handwrite it, to increase that pace and increase that productivity, encourage editing, things like that. For secondary school aged students, that role about what do my peers think of me, how do I look in front of my mates? That's so important to them. And that does make the difference between if they do or don't use a tool.
Yeah.
So if those tools are normalised for all young people in the classroom, that goes away. And what you then have is all of that toolkit, resources, your ability to rewind the teacher, the direct instruction videos, the sentence structures, the word banks, the help resources, all those things. If they're all in the fingertips of all of the learners, it's just normal to use all of those materials and tools then. It makes a massive difference on a sense of belonging, on a sense of dignity, and ultimately on a sense of progress and attainment for those young people.
Fiona, you've been studying students and how they learn and education in general for years now. How do we foster a lifelong love for learning?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that students aren't motivated to learn. And I hear some school leaders saying that sometimes. And I think that's ridiculous, because young people are highly motivated to learn. They're just not always motivated to learn the things we're giving to them in our school environments. And that's because they don't necessarily see why those things are relevant to their lives, or they don't have the interest in those spaces. That's on us to really demonstrate the clear links between the things that we're offering to our young people as learning experiences and why they would want to learn those things, why they might be helpful to them, or why they're great vehicles for developing specific lifelong skills. But it's not that children aren't motivated to learn. They're motivated to learn. We just need to make sure that our classrooms are motivating places to be. That's on us.
We talk about 21st century skills a lot in education. What does that mean to you?
21st century is here. We're in 2025. So these are today's skills, right?
Yeah.
And the skills that young people need and want today are the skills of living in a contemporary, global AI-infused world. They're the skills of understanding what we need to find out, what we need to learn, what we need to do, and the skills of being able to do those things. They're the skills of being able to be innovative and creative, but they're not future skills. We keep talking about the future like we're getting ready for something. The future is now. These young people are alive and living today, and they need to be successful learners today in order to move towards tomorrow, next week, next year. So maybe we need to think a little bit more about what are today's skills, not just this year, but literally today.
And Fiona, assessment will still be happening. How do we think about assessment in this new age of generative AI?
I get really excited about some of the possibilities that we have open to us now, particularly around great things like Notebook and Gemini and all of the other future-ready forms of assessment that are already here and already available to us. So we think about assessment as diagnostic, as formative, as summative, and we can represent what we need to assess in a manifestation of different ways. Now, those assessments might be traditional forms of digitised versions of old school traditional style assessment, but also we can represent ideas in different ways and assess in different ways. So we might represent learning orally and have kind of a Viva-based approach. Professor Sagata Mitra championed that very holistically. We know the importance of developing oracy skills, and those are going to be vital to that.
Yes.
And of course, Oral skills, oral contributions can be transcribed, can be assessed via AI. It doesn't have to be suddenly off a text-based assessment processing view of things. We can also think about other kinds of representation. So learners love to create artifacts. They might be mini websites, they might be digital portfolios, but what's the most appropriate way for a learner to represent their knowledge and understanding of skills? Let's start there. What can a learner represent and can do? What format will bring the best out of them? And then let's make that assessment system fit around that, rather than the student having to fit into the assessment system that sometimes is just like an old steam train working in an electric train system.
Fiona, in this new era of AI, I've heard you speak recently a little bit about how you're excited with what it might mean for self-directed learning. Can you share a bit more about that?
In some of the many great schools I've been working with, their embracing of contemporary learning tools, which includes generative AI, allows young people to really think about the direction that they want to take their lines of inquiry in. So it empowers them to be young researchers, it empowers them to be creative in what they're creating, whether that might be through images, might be through video, whatever it might be. Now, when we think about young people's skills they're developing in those spaces, they're in a scenario where they're needing to think about, how am I going to follow a line of interest? Which tools am I going to use to help me develop that line of interest? And what we tend to see happen is great teachers really stimulating the curiosity, stimulating their thinking with an idea, a provocation, a resource, whatever it might be. And then providing young people with a toolkit just to follow that, to expand that, to take that. And they take their learning in the most fascinating of directions. I mean, you put guardrails, you put parameters around that in terms of keeping a focus, in terms of curriculum. But young people can then continue that learning beyond a lesson, beyond a school day, take their learning home, talk about it with friends, family, talk about it with multi-generational members of the family and the community.
Yeah.
So their learning is then not just about these little pockets of curriculum in school, but their learning is about something that transcends the school walls, transcends the school day. And in doing that, our learners are developing all kinds of skills, like, what do I want to know? Why do I want to know it? How will I find it out? Where do I take it next? How do I know that I know something?
How do I know that I know? Great one. Yeah.
How do I know what I don't know yet?
Yeah.
Those are the sorts of skills that set young people up to be lifelong learners. And that really is what we want schools to be doing, isn't it?
And Fiona, how do we as adults remind ourselves to put young people, children, students at the centre of their learning?
So I think pretty much every school would say learners are at the heart of what we do. Everything we do is about our young people. But here's my challenge to that. When we walk into a school, into a classroom, just breathe that classroom in, and then where's the centre of gravity in the room? And too often that centre of gravity is with the teacher. It's like a boomerang. Everything's coming out and back to the teacher all the time. There's elements of the lesson, elements of classroom function where that's necessary. But too often, that centre of gravity stays with the teacher. If we think about leadership monitoring of learning walks and lesson observations, what do they tend to watch? They tend to monitor the teacher and what the teacher's doing. And that's a bit of a challenge, isn't it? Because actually, who's the most important person in a classroom? It's the young people. It's the students in our classrooms. And the centre of gravity for class lessons that are meant to be about young people's learning, the gravity should be with the young people.
Yeah.
The teacher is there to meet the needs of the young people. The learners are not there to be an audience for the teacher. It's a very, very simple shift to just be in that classroom space, think how can we keep that learning gravitating back towards our young people and allow them to hold their own sense of gravity. So one student said to me, it's my learning, I want to hold it, I want to own it. Why would we challenge that?
And Fiona, how would you describe this generation of students in a word?
Curious, agentive, informed. Not always about the things that teachers want them to be curious, agentive and informed about, but they are curious, they are agentive and they are informed. And those are things we want to nurture, right?
Absolutely. Fiona, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure and we very much enjoyed having you here.
Thank you so much for having me as part of this. Thank you.
You're very, very welcome.